because we definitely need to give love to the books that deserve it, you know? My hair is curly today, and so it's just not doing it. Hi everybody, my name is Kelsey, and we're about to get very, very nerdy with books that I think deserve just a little bit more love. So I'm not entirely sure where this idea came from, but I was just kind of thinking about books as we were moving all of the books down here, kind of what was on the shelves. And one of the things that I kind of was thinking about was books that I loved and probably haven't talked about enough, but also like I've not heard anybody talk about these. So today I narrowed it down to 10, but today I want to talk about 10 books that I just genuinely loved and probably haven't talked enough about, but I also haven't heard anybody talk about. We've got some YA, some adults, some romance, some poetry, some middle grade, like we've got a bunch of stuff here. So I'll leave, of course, everything linked down below if you'd like to check out these books yourself. I highly recommend, but let's dive in. The first one is one that I got actually the ARC from the author and then purchased myself, which was Sleeping Around by Morgan Vega. I loved this book. Like I said, I got the ARC and I was able to read it ahead of time, and I read it on vacation. And it was so good. I got hooked almost right away. We follow our main character, Corey, who's part of the foster care system, and she is going off to college. So she's 18, which means that she is aging out of the foster care system. And she's going off to college. She is musical, as you can see here. She's holding a violin case, so she's very musical. And she gets to college and she has like this very clear idea of what she thinks it's going to be. She's been living with the same foster family for a while, but if I remember correctly, it's been a couple of years. She kind of bounced around, so this was just the most recent one. So you've got a lot of feelings of maybe abandonment and just a lot of complicated feelings with her because she's in the foster care system, but then she goes to college and does not get along well with her roommate and therefore bounces around, sleeps on people's couches. It's also about her trying to get into the music department, and there's a guy, of course there's a guy that she has become friends with, and it's way more than that, but it's literally says up here, catching Z's in all the wrong places. It was really fun. It was really a cute story, but it had this very interesting story underneath of the foster care system, which I loved. I haven't seen a lot of books that feature the foster care system. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but this was the first thing that I read that was like this, especially aging out of the system. Like, you have a lot of stories of people, like middle grade stories probably, of kids in the foster care system, or stories of kids who used to be in the foster care system, like they're adults now. But this is the first story I had read that had a protagonist who had aged out and was at the age of aging out. And so it was also great. It gave me a lot of like nostalgia for my time in college. So like if you want a college set book that doesn't have any kind of smut in it, it feels like a YA and its romance elements, this is good. I highly recommend. It's also indie published, so get you this book if you haven't already. The next one is a stand-in for the entire series, and the reason I probably haven't talked a lot about this is because I read it before I started BookTube, but that is the Kart series by Cornelia Funk. As you can see, this book, very well loved. It's quite literally falling apart. I have all three in this trilogy. Maybe I'm not in the right circles, and I'll admit that, like, at least in the middle grade circles that I have come through, I've only seen it mentioned like maybe once or twice, and it's always been in passing. But this is such a good book. Follow our main character Maggie and her father, and it takes place in like a contemporary setting, but her father has this ability to, when he reads out loud, he pulls things from the story and brings them into our world, but on the reverse side of that, something from our world goes into the story. And so way back when Maggie was an infant, he read this story called Kart, and a couple of the characters from the book came out and his wife went in, and so he has refused to read out loud since then. These magical characters who have come out of the world are searching for him again. So it's like a race against time. And then of course it continues from that. This one was actually made into a movie, and it's been a long time since I read that or watched it. The father's played by Brendan Fraser. And if I remember correctly, it was actually a pretty decent adaptation. So here's a book. If you like stories about things in books coming to life, this is your book. It's quite chunky, but it's really easy to get through. I flew through these pretty quickly, and it's a trilogy, so there's only 3, and it just continues the fantastical story. I don't know. I loved it. I loved it so much. The next one is actually the very first arc I ever read or was gifted on NetGalley, and that is Roaring. This is by Lindsay Duga. I have actually not read anything else by this author, so I probably should. I believe this is indie published as well, but this is a fantastical story about dragons and sirens and just magical mythical creatures, but it's set in the Roaring 20s. This follows our 2 main characters. One of them is named Colt. I cannot remember what the girl's name is, but Colt is part of this like subsect of like an FBI government kind of department, and his job is to hunt down these monsters who are not doing the appropriate things according to the law. One of these creatures who has been quoted as dangerous are sirens, because they can make anybody do anything. And for some reason, he has the ability to not fall under their spell. So the book really kicks off with, like, there hasn't been a siren in years, and then one just magically shows up. And so it's the 2 of them. He meets her and then discovers that, like, not only is his department after her, but there's, like, some mobsters after her as well, and they kind of go on the run. But it's, like I said, set in the 20s, so it has that very, like, 20s jazz age vibes. But there's, like, every magical creature you could possibly think of in this book, and I genuinely loved every second of it. There's some twists and turns. There's some stuff that happens in here. It is a little bit of a romance between the 2 of them, and I loved it. And like I said, I literally have not heard anybody else talk about this book. And I was lucky enough to get an arc of it, and then obviously buy my own copy because I'm obsessed with it. It's perfect for those like fantasy vibes. And it's probably due a reread because it's been quite a long time since I read it. But it was so good. And I loved it. And like, yes, fantasy fans, you need this. And then I've got a couple, I actually put them back to back without meaning to, my 2 poetry-esque books. The first one is Voices. This is The Final Hours of Joan of Arc by David Elliott. I read this one quite a few years ago and talked about it on the channel quite a lot. I read another book by this author, but this one just was better in my opinion. It's quite literally the story of Joan of Arc. As you can see, it's written all over the place, but this is written from the perspectives of not just people, but of objects as well. Like, it's just her story, especially the end of her life, but from the most random places. And then also, if I remember correctly, this author uses chunks. I might be wrong, but oh yeah, there it is. He uses chunks from the trials of Joan of Arc. It was a really fascinating story. I'm fascinated by the story of Joan of Arc, so I have read quite a few things. Not recently, but like just about her, and this one just hit perfectly. So if you're at all interested in Joan of Arc as a story, I recommend this, even if you're not a big poetry person, just because it's not poetry in the sense of like everything is rhyming. It's just written like I showed you in like non-linear ways, and I just really enjoyed the story because I thought it was such a very creative way of telling this story that we know pretty well because it's actual history, but in like a very different light. So it's also not very long. So if you need something for like readathons in the future, highly recommend. The next one is like a legit poetry collection of it that was not poetic, but you guys know what I mean. And I read this, I think, my very first magical readathon or somewhere close to that. But it's Yesterday I Was the Moon by Nor Unar, who I have now discovered does have another poetry collection, and I need to read it. But this one I loved because it had pictures in it. All the poems are really, really short, as you can see. Some of them are quite literally just like a few like sentences, and then you have some longer ones. But I have not been so seen in a poetry collection until I read this book. And this was, I think, like I said, I think it was for the very first like magical readathon, so I'm thinking my very first year like here on YouTube. I read this book, and I just got, like, there's so many things that are tabbed in this because I had so many moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I relate to that. So I'm going to read you this little thing just to give you an idea. But it says, this book contains poetry about art, heart, people, home, you, courage, self-love, strength, culture, acceptance, survival, and no particular order. So it's just a very unique, I think, way of doing a poetry collection, especially if you are someone who, like I mentioned earlier, is not like the biggest fan of poetry, but also doesn't like the rhymingness of it. This is a very interesting, like, non-linear, non-rhyming, just way of looking at the world, and I love it. It's super short. Highly recommend if you are at all interested in feeling all your feels. Here you go. Please read this. I will never stop raving about this, even though I haven't talked about it in a few years. But still, like, seriously, so good. All right, the next is a middle grade that I read a few years ago, and that is Lily and Duncan, and this is by Donna Gephardt. This I loved because it is, I actually mentioned this in a video I did quite a few years ago about required reading and like books that I would consider should be required reading. So this book follows two friends, Lily and Duncan, and Lily is in the process of, Lily's trans, and is in the process of trying to get puberty blockers from her parents. And so you've got her, and then you've got her best friend Duncan, who is dealing with a lot himself. But it mentions here on the, and like the, whatever that's called, that he's dealing with bipolar disorder, and he's just moved to a new town. So it's their friendship, but as you can tell, there's way more to both of their stories. But I think it was a beautiful way of introducing a trans character, but also mental health in a YA book. So I highly recommend this. I read this, like I said, a while ago, and I still think about it all the time. So, like, this is a book that I would consider should be required reading for schools, just so that, like, kids can be introduced to some of these topics. And I thought it was done beautifully. All right, the next one is purely just because I don't know anybody else who's talking about this, and I need other people to talk about it with me. And that is The Missing Manuscript of Jane Austen by Scribd James. I've literally not shut up about this book. So if you don't know about this book, where have you been? I read this like a year or two ago, and it's basically, I also talked about it recently in my video of Jane Austen adaptations that I loved. This one is presenting as, like, there's this manuscript that she wrote but never published, and it starts with a woman who is in London, or in England, and basically gets this poetry collection from a antique shop, discovers that there's like a letter hidden in the back, and it is an unfinished letter that Jane Austen was writing to her sister Cassandra. And in it, she hints at the fact that there was a manuscript of sorts that has been left in a house. And so she kind of goes down the rabbit hole and figures out what this house is, what she thinks the house that she was staring at the time, that kind of thing, and kind of convinces the guy who owns the house and is trying to get basically rid of it. I believe it was his parents' house, and so he's trying to go through it and pawn off the house. And so she finally convinces him, and they go searching the house and find this manuscript. So 80 to 85% of this book is actually the physical manuscript that you are reading along with the main two characters, and then there are chapters at the beginning and then like throughout, and then obviously at the end, that are from these two characters' perspectives as they like are reading it, and then they, you know, step back and they have like a moment of like, oh, we should probably take a break, let's go eat something. And so you've got a couple of chapters in the present, and then you dive back into the manuscript. And I really liked it because it's written very well, in my opinion, as close to Jane Austen as you probably could get. This author has clearly studied Jane Austen as a writer. I've read quite a few things by Scribd James, so she's just a really good author to begin with. But in this one specifically, it's supposed to be presented as like a manuscript before any of her other novels. So like you see hints in this book to a bunch of characters that show up in Jane Austen novels, and it's presented like this was the first draft of them. But I'm reading this book, and it's giving me all the feelings that I got when I was reading Jane Austen for the first time. So highly recommend if you want a historical fiction story, because while yes, it's technically set in the present, like I said, most of this book is the actual manuscript, and you're reading this manuscript. So I just love it, and I just wanted to put it on here because I don't know anybody else who's talked about this book, and I will not stop raving about it. I think everyone needs to read it if you are a historical romance or historical fiction or Jane Austen fan in general. All right, the next one is for my historical fiction lovers slash Greek mythology lovers, and that is Lovely War by Julie Berry. This is one that I read like a year ago, and I even gave it to my mother-in-law at one point because I was like, you must read. And she's not a big Greek mythology person, but she did enjoy it. So this is a World War II, I believe. It's set in, sorry, World War I and II. It crosses both wars. And it basically is presented like Aphrodite is on trial and is giving examples as to why she did some of the stuff that she did, and it follows two couples in real life that cross both wars. And so she tells the story of these two couples, and it's from her perspective. You have a bunch of other gods' perspectives. You've got Ares, because obviously he's the god of war. You have Hades, who shows up since he's the god of the dead. And there's one more, because Hephaestus is there, but he doesn't explain the story. I can't remember. There's one more god. Oh, Apollo. That's the other one. You've got these four gods. Like, she calls on these other guys to like show up to help her tell the story from their perspectives, and like they each bring a different perspective to the story. But it's very, very loosely like, this story is about these four people, these two couples during World Wars I and II, and one of them is a mixed race couple, which is something you don't see very often in a World War II setting. So I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a fascinating story. I do not like books, usually books set during World Wars I and II. I feel like the market is oversaturated with them. So like the idea of reading a book that's set during a war and you know it's going to be hard and sad, I usually steer clear from them. This made me care. So I just like the way it was told. It does take you a while to get into it, so you just kind of have to go with the flow. But what I love about this story is there's so many layers, because like, yes, you've got the story about the two couples, and then they're being told by the Greek gods, but then there's also a reason, because Aphrodite is on trial, why she's telling the stories. And then there's even like more once you get to the end of like the story as to like what's been going on with like their situation. So there's a lot of layers. It's just really a really complex story without being hard to understand. And I loved it, and I don't think I've heard, maybe I'm in the wrong circles again, but I don't think I've heard anybody talk about this. So I recommend, if the time period at all is interesting to you, or if Greek mythology is interesting to you, because like they mesh pretty well in the story. All right, so the next one is another book that is kind of an indie published book, and that is A Daughter of the Trolls, by Mackenzie Catron. This is the first in, I think it's supposed to be a trilogy, but there's two out right now, and I know the author is dealing with a lot of health stuff, so we'll see if we get the third one. But it's just a fun YA fantastical story. I rave about this. I got the arc of this, and I loved it. I do not read things physically very fast, and I read this book in like a few days, I think. Like, it's not very long, but still, I read it pretty quickly. So this follows our main character, Sparrow, and she lives in this meadow, or this grotto, with a bunch of different magical creatures, including trolls, and this big bad boogeyman style nightmare person shows up, and due to circumstances that happen, her mom goes missing, and so she has to go on this adventure with her best friend, who's half goblin. His name is Rush, and he goes with her on this adventure to try to figure out what happened and find her mom. But Sparrow is in a wheelchair, and so you have the conversation of her kind of dealing with having been in the wheelchair her entire life, and also like she's going through the woods, which is not easy for even someone who has the ability to walk. And so like she just has a really hard time in the woods. And it's also written, it's an own voices story, because something that the character has is very, very similar to what the author has, and why the author has lived her life in a wheelchair as well. And so it's just an interesting story, because you know that the conversations in here, especially like she's having conversations with her best friend, and he says things that you're like, no, wait, that's wrong, don't do that. But like even like someone close to you can mess up and say the wrong thing. And so you know that these conversations that are being had in this book about this representation come from a very real place, I assume. based on who the author is. So I love this book. It's a great fantasy story. It's got some romance elements to it. It does have a little bit of like horror elements to it when you get to the end. It's not horror. I wouldn't consider it a horror in any way, shape, or form, but some of the kind of like villain characters are creepy beyond all get out. So just be wary of that. But honestly, like, I am a chicken. I hate all things horror, and I was okay. So you'll be fine. But it's a good YA story that I highly recommend, and it's got some good representation, which you don't see every day. And then the last one is one that I've definitely talked quite a lot about, which if it's not my favorite historical romance, it's like top 5, but I'm pretty sure this is my favorite. Like, I can't think of anything that would bump this out of spot right now. And that is Never Seduce a Scot by Maya Banks. I adore this book because A, it's a Scottish romance. You guys know I love me some Scottish romance. But B, our main character is deaf. So you have some representation in a historical romance, which is just amazing to me. So this book has our 2 main characters. We have Evelyn and Graham, and it takes place in this world where their clans are at war with each other. And so the king basically has had enough of this, and he's like, all right, here's what we're going to do. You, from this clan, your daughter is going to marry the guy who's the laird of this clan, and there you go, and everything's going to be fixed. They're like, that's not how this works. She basically is taken from her homeland and put into a clan that has been told is like despises her, and she can't hear. So you have that situation. She was in an accident when she was much younger, and she was betrothed at the time, and the guy who she was betrothed to is a giant creep and freaked her out. And so this, because she didn't have the ability to hear, people thought that she was daft, and so she just kind of let them think that because it got her out of this engagement. But then she goes to the new clan, and Graham is a genius and kind of figures out that some stuff doesn't add up. So I loved it. I loved the representation. I loved the Scottish romance. I love the 2 of them. Everything about this book is beautiful and amazing. It's 5 stars. I love it. But like, I don't know a ton of people who have probably read this book when it comes to like the historical side. I feel like Maya Banks is, well, yeah, maybe I'm just, again, wrong circles, could be, but like, at least in the circles that I run online, it's a lot more of things like Lisa Kleypas and some of those names that are more well known, and Maya Banks has a smaller backlogged list. I also believe that she writes over genre, so I believe she's got some thrillers out there as well, but like, she doesn't have a ton of historical romance, which is fine, but that doesn't mean like a lot of people talk about her. I don't know. I literally picked this up because my friend Taylor had it on her TBR, and then we ended up buddy reading this together, and we both loved it, and it's both our favorites. And I think we sectioned this book, and both of us just like finished it in like 2 days or something because we couldn't stop reading. So love it. Highly recommend if you're interested in sorry, I'm backtracking here. I even gave this as a recommendation to my best friend Lauren, and she and I agree on some stuff, but not on some other stuff. Like, she does not usually go out of her way to read historical romance, and she read like all of Maya Banks' books and was like obsessed with them. So it could be you. It could be you too. You could be on the bandwagon. But this one is one that like I will never stop talking about, and I love it. But that's it. That is a look at some of the books that I would consider books that probably, again, in my circles, don't have as much love as I think they deserve. I don't know a lot of people who are talking about them, so I hope you guys enjoyed. Please let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in today's video. I would love to know, especially since they're books that I don't see a lot of people talk about, if they're ones that you love. But also, if there's a book or book series or a few books that you can think of that you think deserve more love, leave them down in the comments. I would love to know what are some books that you loved that you don't see anybody talking about, because we definitely need to give love to the books that deserve it, do you know? But if you enjoyed this video, and I very much hope that you did, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you'd like to be part of this awesome growing family. I've also got all my social media down there, as well as other fun bookish links, so check all that out, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!